We have moved on to the next little subsection we got here on church history, which is where we've done kind of lessons 41 through 45 inclusive, covering the period of what we academically call sub-Roman Britain, what we in our time call the Great Arthurian Age, right? The Arthurian Age of Britain. This time in which the Roman army and the Roman Empire administratively has withdrawn from Roman Britannia, as it was known, and you get this massive migratory period that occurs really all around Europe by the various Germanic tribal confederations, like we've covered before, including, obviously, we looked specifically at Clovis I, who was the founding king of the Franks, who through his conversion to Christianity then introduces Christianity to the Franks, right, the French, as they become known now today. We're continuing on this kind of Western, Northwestern, or in this case Northern European avenue, right? And from basically less kind of 4, almost 5 lessons now from this one, just an introductory lesson today, we're going to be covering a period that kind of comes out of the 5th and 6th centuries in Britannia, which we call the Great Missionary Age of Britain, okay? To remind you of where we left off, by and large, okay? We covered a variety of different notable figures from this time period, like St. Patrick, of course, very important and influential in bringing Christianity to Ireland, particularly. We covered a variety of other figures like St. David in Wales, and we then did a lesson specifically on some of the main portions of pretty much the only major written work from in and around this time period from a scholar and historian known as St. Gildas, called On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain in English, okay, which was detailing much of the history of the fall of Roman Britain, the arrival of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, these Germanic tribes across the North Sea, who in various different ways are invited in and then invade and migrate, so on and so forth. The Picts up in the north, right, who eventually get assimilated into the Scots. We're going to touch on them a bit here today in incoming lessons, as pagans invading down south, so on and so forth, right? Christianity and really the survival of the Christian people, the Celtic Britons, who are functionally the ancestors of the Welsh and much of the people of the British Isles these days, is really touch and go. In fact, their survival is quite frankly on the brink. And they are being deeply overrun by these various Germanic peoples in the form of who we call eventually the Anglo-Saxons, or the English as they eventually come to be known. In essence, to give you an idea, and you have this image on the flip side of your handout today, we're going to reference this map and other maps like this across the coming weeks of this particular subsection, is that this, certainly by the year AD 600, okay, is basically where the landscape of things are resting, okay? Colorized in various different forms. You've got a key up in the kind of center, upper middle portion, right there. In regard to the language groups, you've got the different actual people groups identified in both historic and modern terminology, right? So the Irish, or the Gaels, sometimes known Gaels, right? Speaking Gaelic or Gaelic as a language, okay? In Ireland, you have in blue, both the light blue and the dark blue there, on the island of Great Britain itself, you have the Picts up in the north. These were the original inhabitants of that northern part, basically what today is called Scotland. The ones who the Romans built Hadrian's Wall, for anyone familiar with Britain, to keep them out, right? The much shorter Great Wall of northern Britain, not of China. You then have the regions south of that in the light blue, which are the Celtic Britons, right? The people who had been conquered by the Romans all the way back beginning in 44 AD, who had been living under Roman rule for 400 years. The Romans then evacuated in 410 AD. We covered all of that in previous lessons, right? But by this point, at least loosely speaking, you have the arrival in red of 3 groups ultimately, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. This map does not show the invasions and migrations of the Jutes, right? That'll be in other maps later on, but who we broadly come to refer to as the Anglo-Saxons, okay? You can already start to kind of see the loose framing of many of the modern nations, what are called the home countries of the United Kingdom or of the British Isles generally, right? You have Ireland, the actual island itself of Ireland. You have Wales in what is today that part where it says Britons, right? There are 2 major kingdoms, Dyfed in the south, Gwynedd in the north there. You have the red part, which is building the formation of what becomes England, and then, of course, the blue and green up in the top becoming what eventually is Scotland, right? The reason for showing this is, and the reason why this period, or this section we're about to cover in the coming lessons, is called the Great Missionary Period, is because at this particular juncture, at least in this snapshot right here, you have in the blue the Picts, who are pagans, okay? Historic Pictish paganism that had been around for thousands of years. You have in the red the lands that are growing, and they continue to grow even from that point, of the Angles and the Saxons, and to a lesser degree the Jutes, who are, of course, Germanic pagans themselves, okay? They are essentially like the Vikings would be a couple of centuries later on from this point, right? The Britons, the Celtic Britons in the light blue, they are Christian, almost overwhelmingly, right? 90% Christian by this point. But also by this time, this is an important distinction, the Irish are Christians as well. That's why we covered St. Patrick, okay? We saw in those lessons, going back, lesson 41, 42, 43, around there, that during St. Patrick's life, when he, having been captured by Irish pagan raiders, is enslaved in Ireland for 6 years, essentially, from the age of 16 onward, he then returns back to Ireland to evangelise and bring Christianity to his former captors, right? And he's so successful in his evangelisation of both kings and peasants alike that the majority of Ireland effectively converts to Christianity during his own lifetime, okay? Well, by this point, and by this point I'm talking about, roughly speaking, the latter half of the 6th century AD, so the 500s, late 500s, we're 150 years, essentially, after the time of St. Patrick, right? Christianity has now been in Hibernia, as it was called by the Romans in Latin, right? Ireland, from its native name, Erie, Christian, okay? It's 150 years of Christianity, which is not that long, right? But nevertheless, it's not 5 minutes, okay? It's been around for 100, 150 years by this point. The preponderance of the Irish kings are Christian. The nobility, the aristocracy are Christian. The peasantry, the commons are Christian overwhelmingly. Even now, that light shade of green, if you look there between Ireland and where Scotland is, if you know there, you will see in light green a kingdom called Dalriada, okay? This was a Gaelic kingdom, or what we call a Scottish kingdom, right? The name Scotland comes from the Scotti, S-C-O-T-T-I. Scotti was another name that the Romans called the Irish, okay? They migrate across the Irish Sea, and they settle in the Hebrides, and the Outer Hebrides, Inner Hebrides, those island chains of Scotland that are famous, of course, and they start establishing a kingdom, basically what is today Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, okay? Eventually, later on, when we go through the rest of the early medieval period, those kings of Dalriada are going to conquer Pictland, as it was originally called, right? They're going to conquer the pagan Picts, many of which have converted to Christianity by this point, some of which are still pagan, and the Scotti and the Picts are going to assimilate together to become who we know today as the Scottish. That's going to happen basically in the 9th century AD, okay? Either way, part of what's happening here through the kingdom of Dalriada is that there is this great vision, essentially, right? This kind of idea, this practice of the Irish Christians realising basically the landscape of what's happening in the British Isles, as we call it now, okay? The Celtic Britons, keeping in mind that Ireland is Christian because a Celtic Briton, St. Patrick, brought Christianity to Ireland, right, are now on the brink of conquest, okay? You can see there that that land is a slither compared to what it once was, which was basically the entire island, of course, right? You have the Picts, who are pagan, who are constantly raiding and invading from the north. The Anglo-Saxons constantly raiding and invading from the east and the south. We've covered that before, right? If you even look toward the bottom of your map, you'll see another light blue section, the Bretons, B-R-E-T-O-N-S. Do you see that down there? Okay. That is the peninsula called Brittany today, B-R-I-T-T-A-N-Y. It's called as such, and you can hopefully hear the similarity with the name Britain, right? The Anglo-Saxon incursions and onslaughts were so significant, particularly among the Saxons in the south, okay, of the island, that a number of Celtic Britons actually evacuate the island, They can't defend themselves and they can't afford to get pushed back further. So they actually leave the island of Great Britain, cross the Channel and settle just west of Normandy. Okay? And that place is called Brittany, settled by Bretons, right? They're very French now these days, but in this aspect, Breton as a language is still around in France, in that peninsula to this day. Okay? All these things are going on. And what those Irish Christians realise is Christianity is on the brink of collapse on the island of Great Britain, because the Celtic Britons are holding on for dear life against the Anglo-Saxons, but they're losing. And we know by inference, at least, that there is no attempt from the Celtic Britons to try and evangelise the Anglo-Saxons. Okay? The reasoning for that should be hopefully fairly straightforward and obvious, because, well, quite frankly, they're too busy surviving and trying to fight and not die at the hands of the Anglo-Saxons, right? You can't exactly launch, significant missionary, Christian evangelistic missionary journeys and operations to the people who are wave after wave after wave invading against you and fighting against you, right? It just doesn't work. So there's no evidence specifically at all that the Celtic Britons ever evangelised the Anglo-Saxons, right? Certainly not mentioned by St. Gildas in that near contemporary work, okay? So there's a real threat of Christianity going extinct in the land that it had lived in now for 500 years, right? We covered before, in some of these lessons, Christianity arrives in the British Isles in Roman Britannia, the brand new province of Roman Britannia, Britannia itself, in 54 AD, okay? And is adopted very quickly, right? And really certainly definitely by the 3rd century and absolutely by the 4th, the vast majority of Celtic Britons are Christian, right? So the Christianization, in other words, the conversion of the Romano-British people, as we call them, the Celtic Britons living under Rome, right, who had amalgamated with Roman custom a lot, overwhelmingly Christian, right? But it's now on the brink of potential collapse because these Anglo-Saxons could well continue to conquer. They could keep conquering. Dumnonia, as it was, one of the kingdoms there, what today is the Cornish Peninsula, right? They could continue to conquer across the mountains of Snowdonia into what is today Wales. There's all kinds of things that could happen, right? These kingdoms among the Celts are collapsing one by one by one, okay? Those various lands that you see in the red, if you have a look there, especially on your page, right? Bernicia and Dearia in the north, that's a land that becomes known as Northumbria later on, a unified kingdom, settled by Anglos, right? Anglians, in this case, the Angles. Places like Mercia, if you look just above the word Saxon, you'll see Middle Angles, East Angles, okay? And Mercians, these are all Angle peoples, right? Anglish. And then down south you see things like East Saxons, West Saxons. These are the places which eventually, along with others, become known as Essex, the East Saxons, Wessex, the West Saxons, Sussex, the South Saxons, okay? Right? Even other names, they're not listed here, but in East Anglia, the north of East Anglia were called the Northern Folk, or Norfolk, okay? The Southern Folk, or Suffolk, okay? It's like Norfolk Island, right? The first fleet, right, settles here in Sydney, and then obviously the rule over Norfolk Island is established, right? It's called Norfolk Island because it reminded them of one of the islands off of East Anglia, where the North folk were. Okay. All these names come from these kinds of places. The Irish Christians, God bless them, who have been spared and have not had any of these Anglo-Saxon invasions, but have basically been building up this really strong, robust Christian culture now, kind of have this supercharged environment to then start sending missionaries back to the island of Great Britain. Okay? The reason why this is an introductory lesson is because we're not going into specifics. We're just going to be covering what we're talking about. Ultimately, the mission that they launched is called the Hiberno-Scottish mission. Right? I mentioned that word earlier, Hibernia. Hibernia was the Roman name for Ireland. Okay? Hibernia. Another name for the Irish people historically is the Scottish. That's why it's weird for us to say Irish, because we have Irish and Scottish as different peoples now, but they are historically, the Scottish come from Ireland. Okay, they're a Gaelic people. If you ever hear Scottish Gaelic as a language, which is one of the Gaelic languages, it sounds very, very similar to Irish Gaelic, okay, for that reason, right? So the Hiberno-Scottish mission up north, they evangelised the Picts and they evangelised those northern parts where it says the word Britain's up north, Reged, right, R-H-E-G-E-D, and then the Northumbrian kingdoms of Bernicia, Deira, and there's other places as well. We'll talk about that more in other lessons, right? That's what's largely launched. Some of these are very influential and famous figures in the history of Christianity, certainly in the British Isles, right? Some of them just even by name, right? Thank you. St. Columbanus, okay? He goes through Britain and actually then is so successful from there, basically, he actually ends up crossing over into the continent and evangelizing all throughout the Frankish kingdom, okay? So the lands of Francia that we looked at with Clovis I, right? He's invited in. He starts establishing hundreds of churches and schools and other kind of things like that, all around what is today basically France, including at that time a separate kingdom, the Burgundians. We talked about them as well, right? But today part of France, okay? As well as that, figures like St. Donald in Wales. He was a chieftain from one of these former Anglo-Saxon lands who ends up having his kingdom defeated and collapsed, right? He has to escape into northern Wales. If you look there on your map on page at least, right? If you see down in the southwest where it says Britons, the bottom one for Britons, B-R-I-T-O-N-S. If you look up, you'll see a funny looking word in Welsh, Gwynedd, G-W-Y-N-E-D-D, okay? That was the most powerful of the Welsh kingdoms established at that time. He finds refuge there, and he actually, of course, is no longer a king. He's no longer a chieftain of anything, right? His kingdom has been conquered and defeated by the Angles. He now becomes a clergyman, okay? He establishes a number of very large schools, especially one in a place called Bangor, which had thousands of theological students, okay? In fact, at its height, it had 7 main deans of the school, each one having responsibility for 300 students each, right? So thousands of students in the seminary or the theological college there in what today we would call northern Wales, right? He's a very influential figure in that, okay? He is a disciple, effectively, of one of these other missionaries that come over from Ireland, right? He's from the island of Great Britain, but he's a disciple of one of these other figures, right? So continue on. This is Saint Aidan, right? He becomes very deeply influential, having been sent by the same figure that sent Saint Donald. We'll mention him just in a second. And he is the primary person, the primary missionary, the clergyman who evangelizes the land that becomes known as Northumbria, okay? So the northern Anglo-Saxon peoples. In fact, the very point of conversion happens because of him directly. He is invited in, right? Specifically because the abbey in a place called Ionia, we're going to look forward to learning about that was established as the base of operation up in Scotland on an island called Iona for the Hiberno-Scottish mission, okay? Their safe refuge away from the Saxons, right? Couldn't be conquered. And it was an island up in the Hebrides of Scotland, okay? It was the base of operation from which they'd send them out. They sent out St. Donald from there. They sent out St. Aidan from there, okay? Oswald, king of Northumbria, who had been dethroned, or effectively really cut off from getting the throne, is a more accurate way, and was sought and hunted by his rival to the pagan throne of Northumbria, was welcomed in and found safe refuge among the Christians at the Abbey of Iona as a child. He then converts to Christianity, eventually goes back and with St. Aidan's help reclaims the throne, mainly through his son, and Northumbria is introduced to Christianity. Okay, it's a really exciting story, actually. We're going to look forward to that, right? All of these gentlemen, and countless others, this is just a snapshot, yep, thank you, are coming through the head operation and the man who's ultimately the most significant figure as kind of the elder statesman of the Hiberno-Scottish mission and the man who really leads that whole operation, certainly throughout most of his life, a man named St. Columba. Okay. The Roman Catholic private school down in Springwood, St. Columbus, that's named after him. Okay, St. Columba. Okay, St. Columba's Catholic school. Right? In fact, many of the churches and other such kind of Christian things up here in the mountains have maintained a lot of those historic British elements, in fact, particularly because the Blue Mountains obviously get traversed and very early on in 1813 during the days of the New South Wales colony, right? So St. Albans, okay, in Lura, for example, right? The Anglican church there, St. Albans, Lura. We covered St. Alban. He's the first martyr in British history, right? The first man killed for the Christian faith. St. Hilda, as in like St. Hilda's Anglican church here in Katoomba, just up the street, okay? St. Hilda is down the line from the Hiberno-Scottish mission. She is an abbess from a place called Whitby. She becomes very, very influential in the 7th century. We'll cover her actually specifically later on when we get to her and to that time period, right? Blue Mountains has a number of these elements, but St. Columba and that school there, St. Columba's High School down in Springwood, is named in honour of really the main man of the Hiberno-Scottish mission, St. Columba. He himself, again, we're going to do a whole biography on him, so I'm not going through the whole thing today, but he was a prince from one of the royal dynasties in Ireland. Okay? So he actually gave up his princely life as part of one of the royal dynasties in Ireland and established in Dalriada this new Irish Gaelic settlement kingdom in what today would be Northern Ireland and the Hebrides of Scotland. This abbey at Iona, in fact, is actually technically given it by one of the Christian kings who have conquered those islands from Ireland, okay? The islands from Ireland. Right? He becomes the single most influential figure. He sends and really commissions St. Donald down in Wales. He directly sends St. Aidan into Northumbria, so on and so forth. All these kinds of things. And in many respects, Scotland, what becomes centuries later, Scotland with the full assimilation of the Scots from Ireland and the Picts who originally inhabited that northern part of Britain, their assimilation into a new people, that ethnogenesis as we would call it in technical terms, those lands of northern Britain become Christian because of St. Columba. He is essentially and effectively, at least by longer distance of time, to Scotland what St. Patrick is to Ireland. Does that make sense? But even through his students and from there on the line of disciples afterward, really Christianity is preserved in the island of Great Britain through the nexus or the funnel of St. Columba, okay? For that kind of very significance, right? Now, the fourth and final figure, who's not directly from the Hiberno-Scottish mission, but actually from a parallel mission which occurs right around the same time, okay? The image you're looking at on screen is a stained glass window of St. Augustine of Canterbury, okay? Not to be confused with probably the more famous, or definitely the more famous St. Augustine of Hippo, okay? In the late 4th, early 5th centuries, right? One of the most famous theological figures in the history of Christianity, maybe even the most. One of the single most famous philosophers of the Western canon, right, as we know it, okay? This is St. Augustine of Canterbury as he comes to be known, okay? He is sent by Pope Gregory the Great, okay, so St. Gregory the Great, Pope St. Gregory, who was Pope of Rome, who was the Bishop of Rome in the late 6th century, so right around the same time period, late 500s. We won't go through the whole story, but long story short, he actually has an encounter and meets a group of Angles, okay, these Germanic tribes, children who had been enslaved, okay? He meets them as he's passing through a city up in northern Italy, and he meets them and sees these literally Anglo children who had been enslaved and were being sold at a slave market, okay? And he inquires who they are, finds out who they are, this and that, blah, blah. He just had, he sees these children taken from some far from land, being sold off in slave markets, blah, blah. And the idea is born to, once he then learns about the fact that their people, the Anglo-Saxons, when you combine them with the Saxons, are pagan and have migrated and invaded into Britain, he then has the idea, well, let's send a missionary journey to evangelize these people. So he commissions a leading scholar from Rome, in this case a man named St. Augustine, okay? So we're going to cover that, and that becomes known as the Gregorian mission, right? In fact, ultimately the two different missions, sorry, next one for me, that we have simultaneously are the Hiberno-Scottish mission in the north and the Gregorian mission in the south of the island of Great Britain. Okay? These are the two great missionary expeditions, right, evangelistic missions, which occur pretty much simultaneously. Okay? And what's fascinatingly, they occur independently of each other. Right? So the Hiberno-Scottish mission is launched by Irish Christians to re-inject vitality and new life, as it were, of Christianity back into the island of Great Britain. And they are operating up in basically what you would call today Scotland and northern England, okay, as well as Wales. At the same time, Rome has sent missionaries to evangelize the Anglo-Saxon pagans in the south of England. Okay? So ultimately what we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering key figures of the Hiberno-Scottish mission and, of course, St. Augustine, who is the key figure of the Gregorian mission. All right? Because really and ultimately it is three figures in particular, which, as I was just kind of highlighting there, even by geographical reference, that are the most important, right, in terms of impact that we'll be looking at, right? So we're going to be looking at St. Columba of Iona, as he's known, okay, who has this deep evangelistic impact on modern term Scotland, right? St. Aidan of Lindisfarne, as he becomes known, he establishes an extremely famous and important monastery on an island called Lindisfarne up in northern England, okay, which becomes the base of Christianity in northern England for centuries and centuries and centuries. In fact, the entire early medieval period, it is the centre of Christianity in northern England, right? And then both those figures from the Hiberno-Scottish mission, alongside or parallel to St. Augustine, as he becomes known, of Canterbury, okay, which is in a place called Kent, hence the term Canterbury, in southern England, having been sent from Rome. Okay, so we're going to cover St. Columba, we're going to cover St. Aidan, we're going to cover St. Augustine of Canterbury as we go through these coming lessons. Right? So that's giving you a good little oversight of what's coming over the coming weeks and lessons that we have this. Of course, we have a church history coming up at some point. A Q&A, I should say, coming up in a couple of weeks' time, a fortnight or so roughly. But either way, the next kind of 3-4 lessons as we work our way through, we're going to cover those major figures. Right? Today was just to give you a snapshot of what on earth we're even covering and doing. But something that's really good and hopefully we're able to take some good value out of, especially when we are, again, the whole purpose of studying history is not just so that we can whip out some irrelevant trivia whenever no one asks us for it, right? The whole point is to learn from the past, to learn from not just the events of the past, although that is important, but to learn more importantly from the people, right? We centered this whole course, now I'll go up to lesson 46, we centered this whole course on the people who have lived these lives, right? Because it's through those people, either individually or collectively, different things we've done, right? Usually individually, that the events of life happen. I mean, there's a reason why these figures are written about historically. There's a reason why their names have carried on. And this disconnect and this rift that we have today, as we've become well acquainted with, we're being, ironically, in an age of mass information and technological availability, we've become so largely historically illiterate that we are worse off for it, right? There is no great benefit at all, in fact, no benefit at all to a people being cut off from history, right? We fail to learn the lessons from the things that happen. We lose the inspiration of mighty heroes and of faithful servants and of all kinds of things, right? There's so much that we lose. And so what the big objective for these lessons, to finish with this point, is going to be, in fact, the real great blessing of studying this missionary age of Britain, is the fact that Christianity on the island of Great Britain, okay, so today what's England, Wales, Scotland basically, comes to the brink of annihilation. But through the faithfulness of the Irish Christians, new life is re-injected into Great Britain to a degree that then eventually, once you fast forward 1,000 years and more from these days, the single greatest missionary expeditions that have ever been launched in the history of the church have come from England, ultimately, globally. So the people who these Irish Christians convert, along with the envoys from Rome, right, through the Gregorian mission, these Anglo-Saxons, they end up becoming one of the great nations of Christianity, England itself. Okay, not that I'm saying that with any bias. Right? Alas, the lessons that's learned is that what God does more importantly, and I'm going to stress this point multiple times throughout, is the locus or the centre of gravity, the epicenter of Christianity in the British Isles escapes Britannia to Ireland, where it survives, and not just survives, it kind of builds up and energises and supercharges itself, while the Celtic Britons are just getting hammered and hammered and hammered by the Anglo-Saxon pagans, right? And then launches itself back onto the island of Great Britain and converts all the pagans of Great Britain, both the Picts and the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and everyone else in between, right? So it's this fascinating victory being snatched from the jaws of defeat kind of time period. It's extremely exciting when you watch it and kind of see it unfold. And we're just going to obviously cover snapshots. We can't cover the whole thing like with any period, obviously. We're going to get the big play-by-play. But that's what we're doing over the coming weeks, right? So, there we go. Probably not many questions, because we haven't really covered any specific detail, which is fine. This is just an introductory lesson to give us an idea of what we're going to be looking at. But, there we go. Good? Cool, guys. All right. So the lesson, just so you know, for next week is we're going to obviously start with St. Columba. Okay? Cover him, cover the abbey that was established at Iona, on the island of Iona. See how that all works. And obviously there's a whole bunch of things from there which will be left to other lessons like with St. Aidan or other things that go on around those kinds of things, right? So we're going to have a lot of confluence and congruence between those various lessons, right?